In 1977, environmental campaign group Greenpeace had bought an old fishing trawler called the Sir William Hardy. Rechristened Rainbow Warrior and refitted as a sailing vessel to lessen her environmental impact, she was now in the South Pacific, conducting protests against and monitoring of French nuclear testing in Polynesia. On the 10th of July 1985, while tied up at Auckland Harbour in New Zealand, an explosion damaged the ship. Then a second, larger one, sank it. Although the crew had been evacuated after the first explosion, photographer Fernando Pereira returned to the boat to retrieve his equipment and was drowned when the ship sank. The New Zealand police investigated and quickly arrested two men travelling on Swiss passports, but who turned out to be officers of the DGSE, the French Secret Service. The resulting scandal, which played out over the coming months, brought down the French Defence Minister Charles Ernoult, while the two agents pleaded guilty to manslaughter and were sentenced to 10 years in prison, though they actually only served 2 years on the French island of Au before being released by the French government. A few days later, simultaneous concerts in London and Philadelphia were held to raise money for famine relief in Ethiopia. Following the success of the Band-Aid single in the UK over the winter of 1984-85, the Live Aid concerts were attended by 72,000 in London and 89,500 in Philly, while an estimated 1.9 billion people across 150 nations, a staggering 40% of the entire world population, watched the live satellite link-up. Other concerts on the day took place in the USSR, Australia, Japan, Austria, Yugoslavia, West Germany and the Netherlands, and were also linked into the broadcast. Live Aid directly raised some $127 million, though exactly how much of that ended up doing good rather than in the pockets of an Ethiopian official or a rebel warlord is still up for debate, but undeniably it also placed famine relief at the centre of the agenda in the First World. And the day before the British Grand Prix, South African leader P.W. Botha declared a state of emergency in 36 more districts of the country in response to continued escalation of unrest, protests, riots and violence in black townships. Pressure was already mounting for the FIA to cancel the South African Grand Prix scheduled for the autumn. Many had long felt that Formula One should join the widespread sporting boycott of the country over its apartheid policies, but Kyalami was a popular track and the only race on the African continent which was deemed important for a world championship. This weekend, however, the teams were at Silverstone for the British Grand Prix, which would mark the halfway point of the season. So far this year there have been 6 winners from 5 teams in the last 7 races, with Prost the only man to have won twice. Of the British contingent, the best chances for a home win probably came from Nigel Mansell, apparently suffering no medical issues from his crash in France, and Derek Warwick, who now had his own updated RE60B chassis. Going backwards were Alfa Romeo, where both drivers were so fed up of the car that the team had actually dug last year's model out of storage, updated it to the new regulations as the 184TB, and had one for Chiva here and another one due for Patrese in time for the next race. Senna also had a new vehicle, but if he did do a lap of Silverstone in his JPS-branded Sinclair C5, the lap time is lost to history. It being England in the summer, the weather was appalling on Friday, with the morning practice delayed because the medical helicopter was unable to take off from its nearby base until a break in the clouds around lunchtime. So practice was shortened to about 20 minutes, with a 10-minute break before the afternoon's qualifying session. By the time that began, the track had dried and everyone on wet tyres had to quickly change them for slicks. Nonetheless, the lap times were pretty good, with Rosberg and provisional pole at an average speed a hair under 160 miles an hour. Saturday was dry but still quite blowy, and it looked like the heavens might open at any minute, so there was an early flurry of activity, then a shower, then the sun came out in time for a late flurry of activity. When all was done, Keke Rosberg sat on pole with a lap in 1 minute 5.591 seconds, a record average speed of 160.925 miles an hour. For comparison, Arnoux' 1983 pole time, the last time the Formula One cars were at Silverstone, was 1 minute 9.462, good enough for 21st this year. Alongside Rosberg sat Nelson Piquet's Brabham, with Prost and Senna on row 2. Nigel Mansell was top Brit in 5th alongside Michele Alboreto's Ferrari. Andrea de Cesaris had a remarkably good lap to put his Ligier 7th, alongside the other Lotus of De Angelis, with Fabi also putting in a good showing in the Tolman, 9th ahead of Niki Lauda 10th. Johansson had his customary indifferent qualifying, but would start ahead of the 2 Renaults. At the blunt end, Brundle was still getting the hang of the Turbo Tyrrell, now sporting white panels for sponsor the Porchester Group, in 20th. Cheever was a deeply unhappy 22nd, Minardi were making some progress in 23rd, and Stefan Beloff was once again adrift in the old Tyrrell and champing at the bit for a taste of the new car, which he had been promised for his home race next time out. The parade lap got underway, although Brundle had some trouble getting away and would have to go round and line up at the back. And then, with the clouds threatening to burst at any moment and a thunderstorm forecast for about half distance, it was time to go. Rosberg, Piquet and Prost all got away well, but it was Senna who got the best start, blasting up from 4th to take the lead going into Copse for the first time. Further back there were two separate incidents, Tombe losing his front end and nerfing Johansson off, and Alio and Ghinzani also colliding. The Swede kept his Ferrari running, but only long enough to limp back to the pits and retire. The other three were out on the spot. Meanwhile, up front, the Williams boys were charging, Rosberg challenging Senna for the lead while Mansell took 3rd from Prost. De Cesaris also had a great start and was 5th ahead of Piquet, Alboreto and Angelis, while Lauda had had a sluggish start and was back in 18th place. Two distinct groups quickly formed at the start as Senna and Rosberg, going at it hammer and tongs, pulled away from Mansell, Prost and De Cesaris, and the Ligier got past the McLaren on the end of lap 2. Then, off camera, Mansell slipped back behind the pair of them and began to drop back as his clutch started slipping. Palmer was out with engine trouble on lap 7, joining the initial 4, and Teo Fabi, whose good qualifying had come to naught with a transmission failure a few laps earlier. Prost got back ahead of De Cesaris at the end of lap 8 to reclaim 3rd, as some spots of rain started to fall. His teammate Lauda was also motoring, moving ahead of Piquet into 7th place, which became 6th when De Angelis toured in with a dead engine, to break his 100% scoring streak so far this year. Freed from De Cesaris' slipstream, Prost quickly charged up to the back of Rosberg, who had lost touch with Senna as his soft tyres began to go off, and was passed in fairly short order, as Rosberg elected not to make a fight of it at this stage. Mansell's race was run on lap 17 as he came in with what turned out to be terminal clutch problems, the same lap as Eddie Cheever's Alfa Romeo expired in yet another smoky turbo failure. Just 4 laps later, it was Rosberg's turn, emitting blue smoke down the pit straight, while Lauda had got past De Cesaris and was now 3rd, and Prost was catching Senna. Behind the top 3, Alboreto was up into the points and took 5th off Piquet as the race approached half distance. When Senna was held up in lapping the battle for 7th between Lafitte and Warwick, Prost was able to close up further, and at 30 laps of 66, the gap was a smidge over 2 seconds. A few laps later and Prost was right on Senna's gearbox and looking for a way past, as Senna approached Alboreto and Piquet to lap them, as they in turn came up to lap Beloff. Nelson was so intent on the Ferrari in front of him that he only saw Senna very late, but then Prost ended up stuck behind him for a whole lap before he got through in turn, so it evened out. Andrea De Cesaris' fine race was run after 41 laps with a clutch failure, as Prost reeled Senna back in after his delay. The two leaders were setting a blistering pace and leaving 3rd place Lauda behind, the Austrian seeming happy just to hang on for 3rd after his abysmal season so far. In fact, by lap 50 with 16 to go, Niki was the only driver that hadn't been lapped by the leading pair. Senna put in a couple of quick laps to try and shake Prost, but to no effect, while Lafitte was putting on a late charge, taking Piquet for 5th, just as Senna's engine began to falter and Prost surged through into the lead. Shortly afterwards, 3rd place Lauda hove into view to be lapped, but it turned out that was because his electrics were on the fritz and he was cruising to his 7th retirement in 8 races. While the cameras watched that, Senna's engine picked up again and he retook the lead from Prost as they came up to lap Sura. Prost was back past at the end of the lap and this time it stuck. Senna's engine cried enough and he pulled over by the pit wall at the end of lap 60. Like Niki, it was his 7th retirement in 8 starts. Prost was now in a pretty unassailable lead, a lap ahead of everyone else, which with 6 laps meant Alboreto, Lafitte, Piquet, Warwick and Sura, who he had just finished putting another lap on. Unless something happened to his McLaren, he looked pretty nailed on for his 19th Grand Prix win. Then, on lap 65 with 1 still to go, the checkered flag started waving, to the confusion of commentators and teams alike. McLaren signalled Prost to continue racing for 1 more lap, as did Brabham for Piquet, while Warwick coasted across the line out of fuel and parked up alongside fellow Renault engine users Senna and De Cesaris' abandoned cars. Lafitte took the flag in 3rd, but then ran out of fuel at the back of the circuit on his way back round, and Piquet also pulled up on the line after doing the extra lap, while Prost ran dry out on the circuit on his slowing down lap. Confusion reigned. The initial results showed Warwick out of the top 6 with Brundle taking the last point, but eventually it was decided that it would be fairest to take the results from the point when the checkered flag was waved a lap early, which meant that the top 6 were Prost, Alboreto, Lafitte, Piquet, Warwick and Seurat, with Brundle, Berger, Patrese and Beloff, and Angelis still running, the latter 28 laps down after the team had sent him back out to gather data after fixing his engine. Just to complete the slightly farcical end to proceedings, Lafitte was stranded out on the circuit and didn't make it to the podium, and then the trophy collapsed in Prost's hands. But Prost didn't mind. He took his 3rd win of the year to move up to within 2 points of championship leader Michele Alboreto, with De Angelis now 11 points off the leader. Ferrari was still top of the constructors' standings and by a decent margin, with McLaren and Lotus close together in points in 2nd and 3rd places.